Morning, and thank you very much for being with us. I have formally to remind the committee, and you indeed, you as witness, that this is a recorded session, and there will be a transcript afterwards which is available for you to change if it doesn't reflect what you think you said and so on. And can I also remind colleagues in the committee that we have to declare any irrelevant interest when we ask questions. That's the formalities over. First of all, welcome and thank you for your time in being with us. We are engaged in an inquiry which we seek to focus, which is on the state of nuclear disarmament and the prospects for the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty Review. But of course there are many, many ancillary background and relevant aspects to it. It's very hard to keep the thing contained. But given that's our ambition, would you like just to begin by sharing your thoughts with us on the MPT review prospects and our own role in all that, and take account of the fact that we can see with our own eyes that the background to this is a very visible shift in the whole prospect for nuclear disarmament, with the old safe world, if we can call it that, of nuclear deterrence looking under attack, and the changing of the balance of power, new weapons coming along which are blurring the old divisions between theatre nuclear weapons, conventional nuclear weapons, international, intercontinental weapons, and so on. It's a turbulent, changing scene against which we have to try and look at the MPT in particular. That's our thought. Just give us your take on that before we go into the detail.
I mean, yes, it's a big challenge, you're quite right, and it's exceptionally complicated. I mean, I think some of the questions that no doubt we'll get into later today will, I suspect, bring in all of the different complexities, different geopolitical situations, and how they relate to this really, I mean, to be honest, the MPT occupies such a primary role in analysts like myself, you know, in our lives and our work. But we have to remember that it occupies a relatively small part of sort of global strategic affairs. But nuclear weapons themselves, on the other hand, have fairly substantial, you know, effects on various different regional security complexes and how they relate to each other. With your specific question on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Non-Proliferation regime, I want to separate the two things out a little bit, because the Non-Proliferation Treaty process itself, you know, that is at the moment going through a sort of, I think, almost a ceasefire. In 2015, in the run-up to the 2015 NPT review conference, there was quite a substantial sort of conflict, if you like, diplomatically between different viewpoints within the treaty on disarmament progress, issues around WMD-free zone in the Middle East, and so on, which led in 2015 to a failure to agree a consensus outcome document at the review conference, which many cited as a failure of the process. On the other hand, addressing the regime in the round, that hasn't resulted in the emergence of new nuclear weapon states. Although there have been, you know, more, well, and I'm sure we'll touch on some of the issues of the geopolitical role of nuclear weapons in, say, Russia, North Korea, and so on, there haven't been substantial changes as a result of that failure in 2015 in the global nuclear landscape. So there is a sort of element where we have to consider the two in relation to each other, but remember the one is, you know, really a narrow reflection of the whole. Within the process, though, the UK has, I think it's fair to say, and I suppose I should declare an interest to some extent, having been in the MOD and Foreign Office at various points at junior level, has been, I think, in the lead in sort of championing the MPT process, the non-proliferation regime as it stands, and indeed in taking unilateral argument on action on disarmament. The question is whether that has been meaningful in terms of its impact in the wider regime. And in the run-up to the 2020 review conference, I think the government, I think the UK has more to do to show that it is, you know, cherishing and taking forward that leadership role.
Well, that's a very helpful start. I mean, I think we'd like to come straight on to some of the sort of precise areas where everything is boiling, if I can put it like that, and is in question. Lord Hannay would like to pursue.
Yes, perhaps we could just have a few minutes on the two big test cases in the NPT, that's to say Iran and North Korea, quite different in their different characteristics. On Iran, perhaps you could just comment on whether you and this is perhaps a little bit crude, but whether you think that the JCPOA approach is the one we should stick with, as the British government is doing and as other European governments are doing, or whether President Trump's approach of withdrawing from it and trying to bring Iran to its knees by sanctions is likely to help the non-proliferation regime or hinder it. And just a few words perhaps on what some of JCPOA might look like, because as the months tick by, we're getting closer to the expiry of some of the JCPOA constraints. And on North Korea, clearly we're in the shadow of a probable further meeting between Trump and Kim. But perhaps you could just say what you think about has been achieved so far, if anything, and what could be achieved and what needs to be achieved if it's not just to be another Trump Potemkin village kind of victory.
Thanks for your questions. I think on Iran, although I should say that I'm not a specialist on the issue, from my reading of the situation, I think that the British government's position on JCPOA, and actually it's fairly stern, really, critique of US policy on this, considering the usual tenor of UK-US discussions on, well, anything diplomatically in particular, but nuclear issues particularly. I think it's actually been quite refreshing to see that level of critique. So I strongly support that, because I think that the approach that the administration in the US is taking is entirely wrong, because the sanctions never brought Iran to its knees in the first place. Sanctions succeeded in creating a perceived security risk within Iran for the supreme leader, that if there was another green revolution, that maybe certain groups that had sustained him at that time would not turn out in the same force again. Now, those circumstances don't exist now. There's this broader support for, well, I mean, frankly, the support for the JCPOA, but the fact that the Iran nuclear issue is to some extent, seen as being dealt with, there's not the international pressure on, say, oil exports that there was in 2011 through 15 that allowed the JCPOA to be achieved. So in terms of what might come next, I mean, I don't see any prospect of the Iranians doing, if I were in their shoes, I would do everything that I was legally allowed to do. I would do everything that I wasn't prohibited from doing, because it's negotiating capital. Because Trump has signalled that there is another negotiation to be had, and so that's how we behave. I think if the JCPOA were still in play with the US, that might not be the same. It would probably be the same, honestly, but it might not be, because there would be an opportunity to pursue restraint on both sides. So that's sort of where I sit on that. On the North Korea side, I mean, I like the way you framed it. How much has been achieved, if any, is sort of leading in a way, and I think, in the right direction. What has been achieved is, we're not at war in North Korea, but we were never going to be at war had the US administration not taken the position it did at the end of, in and around September 2017, responding to North Korea's nuclear tests. So, in terms of the diplomatic achievements, it's quite difficult to pass. You've got the US DPRK process, which is obviously happening at a senior working level, I should say, but still a working level. You've got the summit process, which is achieving rather little in terms of substance. And then you have the South Korea-North Korea track, which is promising in a number of ways, but of course the priorities that the South Korean government has, or the South Korean administration has, I should say, which has a particular character, are not those of the US. They're not, I think, well, my interpretation is that non-proliferation is very low down that list of priorities for the South Korean administration. So the discrepancy in approach between the two allows North Korea to forum shop in some regards, and of course they've chosen the forum that's better for them, which is South Korean discussions. Now, the South Koreans are doing more, I think, on non-proliferation than the US fears. And they could do more, I think, if they were less nervous of the US not wanting them to get into that space, if you see what I mean. But what I am slightly concerned with is the follow-up meeting that we expect to see between Kim and Trump this year. It seems quite likely, as Trump has in every summit meeting that he's had to date with allies and adversaries, that he will emerge from the meeting parroting the line of the person that he's met. We've seen it with Putin in Helsinki, with Abe, even Shinzo Abe in DC. We've seen it with Xi Jinping, and I expect Kim Jong-un will be the latest in that long line. to the dissatisfaction of many, I'm assuming, within the administration who have to try and manage that. So that's a very unfortunate prospect. In terms of what needs to be done, I would like to see the South Korean government, as they have done effectively in reducing the risk of war on the peninsula, create facts on the ground in a way. The rapprochement between North and South has effectively removed the risk of war on the peninsula because it takes the ground out, if you like, from underneath any sort of US desire to do that if it existed in the first place. It precludes that option, really. And what they could do is a similar thing in relation to the nuclear program. Now, what the risk there would be, given that the administration, Moon Jae-in in South Korea is so focused on making progress with the North, that he's more inclined to give up too much in that process. So this is where we have this issue of coordination between the two. But I don't want to go, I mean, as a North Korea specialist, I could talk about that issue for the rest of the session. But that's, I think, the outlines of the situation. If we could have if the North and South could negotiate a broad freeze on North Korea's nuclear program, which is not in place at the moment, there's only a testing freeze. If there could be a broad freeze, which could progress towards verification over a period of time, and then at least almost arms control rather than disarmament. And then, in years' time, maybe we are in a situation where we can talk about reductions, but it does take a while to get to that point, I think. We have to recognise we're not in a disarmament paradigm with North Korea now, we're in an arms control paradigm.
And are we correct in thinking that so far the North Koreans have done absolutely nothing that is of any value in terms of denuclearization? They've produced some token things which don't signify very much. And we assume, are we correct in assuming, that they are going full steam ahead, in fact, in their research, in their development of fissile material and all the rest? They haven't changed any of that, have they?
I think that's fair to say. I mean, in terms of, I think that's the sort of the first order answer is absolutely yes. They haven't given up much of value. I think there is one sort of slightly cautionary note, which is that all we have effectively is a freeze on testing of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. Now, that's very little because, as you rightly point out, all of the other R&D that's below that level can continue. So what I have in mind by a broader freeze is a freeze on that activity as well, much of which could be verified without in-country access, which, of course, is North Korea's biggest bugbear. But what it does provide is there's an attack-defence race here to think about in terms of North Korea's ability to deter or to prevent US intervention in the Second Korean War to protect South Koreans. The US missile defence system has its problems. It doesn't perform to the specification that people would like it to. It has all sorts of issues. But given that North Koreans are not able to flight test missiles under the current situation, are not able to test new nuclear weapons. Yes, they are able to do R&D, but they can't make progress on the critical issue, which is warhead survivability on re-entry, which drives them down some paths, which might mean that US missile defences, which are unrestrained by this, they're able to advance and develop. You're in a situation where you're sort of, if you were to say that the US has no prospect of realistically intercepting North Korean ICBMs, you'd effectively be betting against US R&D, US technology development, which I think is unwise. So, but there will always be a minuscule prospect of a missile making it through, and there's that question of, is that significant?
What do you think of the Chinese leaders who will be telling Kim Jong-un on his visit to Beijing these last few days? Will they be shrugging their shoulders? I mean, they are signatories to the NPT as well.
They are indeed, and they would say that they would say two things. They would say, one, that they exert all efforts to try and bring North Korea back. They would see a negotiated solution, both parties behaving reasonably, etc., and they would cite the joint statements that were put out by the Chinese and the Russians, by Xi and Putin a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, as the sort of process for that. And they would also say, the second thing they would say is that, well, you overestimate the level of influence that we have over the North Koreans. And in both regards, I think actually the plan that they have is not terrible. It's a little bit soft on the North Koreans, but it's okay. In terms of the level of influence they have, that is, of course, it's a bit of a diplomatic dodge. I think diplomatically, of course, they can't tell the North Koreans what to do. Their power over North Korea is one of survival, is one of life and death, if you see what I mean. And the reason they don't, it's not that they can't do anything, it's that it's not in their interest to do those things. And I think that's very important to remember. So what is Xi telling Kim? Well, to be a fly on the wall in that meeting. But the suspicion was after their last conversations that Xi's message had effectively been to stiffen Kim's resolve, had been to say, look, if you hold firm, then you can get more out of Trump than you might have thought. And if you are seen to be behaving reasonably, in inverted commas, then that makes it easier for China to support you in some sense. I think this issue of what China considers to be reasonable for North Korea to do is absolutely critical in understanding what futures are possible on the peninsula.
Right. Well, now let's get back to our own position in this sort of changing scene. Baroness Smith, you want to ask?
Thank you. In some ways, I want to take you back to some of your introductory remarks,
Sure.
because obviously one of the things we're looking at is what's the UK's role in all of this? And as you said, in 2015, there wasn't a great success, and yet we haven't seen a major proliferation of nuclear powers. But clearly what we're not seeing are any significant moves to disarmament at the moment. And you touched on the idea that the UK in the past had led because we'd engaged in some unilateral disarmament, or at least arms reduction, but that we would need to do more ahead of 2020. In what way do you envisage that? Is that in the UK chairing meetings, or is it something that we should be advocating our own type of disarmament?
Yeah, I think, no, it's a good question. I think you're right to pull me up on some of that. Let me be a little bit more nuanced about it. I mean, I think that the UK had attempted to show leadership through unilateral reduction, and at the time those things were done, it seemed like it was a more normative environment in a way. There was a perception that the norm was towards disarmament, and reinforcing that would be a sensible thing to do. As it happens, I mean, my own position in this regard, I mean, practical disarmament, I suppose, might be how I would describe myself. I mean, I think for me the goal is to pursue multilateral disarmament ultimately. I do have a sort of bugging question, which is what is the utility in stimulating greater nuclear powers, larger nuclear powers, who rely more heavily on nuclear weapons to disarm? How does our unilateral disarmament drive that? Because I don't think it does. So then I think, if we are indeed trying to provoke multilateral nuclear disarmament, how best can we do this? And I don't think it's enough to sort of sit there. And so where I think we should do more is not sitting there and waiting for the circumstances to come to us. I think it's about how do we play a part in creating those circumstances. So it narrows the space, really. We've got this issue of surely the UK doesn't want to increase the number of nuclear weapons it has, or change its posture in a sort of negative way for the disarmament portfolio for various reasons. But equally, if it cuts further, then it falls foul of two things. One, the trap that I've just outlined, and two, this idea that, do you have a minimum credible deterrent in the first place, and does it then allow you to trade off against others? So I think there's this issue about how do you sort of square that circle. I think of a few things. I mean, internationally, the UK has played a fairly substantial role leading on arms control verification with non-nuclear weapon states. Again, I should declare a small interest in that. I worked at Aldermaston as a specialist on arms control verification, and latterly as a technical authority for it. So I do have sort of, I guess, an institutional dog in the fight, although I'm not connected to that anymore. I would say that the UK has done an awful lot on that, working with non-nuclear weapon states, Norway and Sweden in particular, also with a greater history of working with the US, a little with China, and then multilaterally as part of the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification. But there is sort of a question of what's it all about? What's the purpose? Is it just about looking good? Is it about, showing others how hard it is to do this disarmament stuff, in which case it's just sort of messaging? Or is it about genuinely preparing for and creating the circumstances where these techniques, tools, could be used in the real world, and thus, because the technical reality moves on, creating a political opportunity for that to happen? And I think that's where we've been lacking. So if, let's say, the UK were to... the US invested heavily on academic research into arms control verification. It sort of spent $25 million over 5 years between, I think it was, let me try and get this right, 2010 and 2015, something like that. Somebody else would have to check back and correct it, I think. But the numbers are right. And that wasn't devoted through the nuclear weapons labs. That was to researchers. That was about creating a climate where there was a pool of people who were interested and motivated and working on technical solutions, recognising that those things wouldn't come out of government, one. And number two, sustaining those who would go into government at a later date so that they would understand what they were dealing with. And the UK hasn't done anything like that. For $25 million over 5 years, that is a tiny, tiny drop in the ocean of the UK's nuclear defence enterprise, defence nuclear enterprise. It's a very, very small amount. Can I ask you to
speak up a little? It's very bad acoustics, yeah.
Sure. So if I just play back to the beginning of that bit. It was around the US has invested sort of $25 million over 5 years under something called the Consortium for Verification Technology, looking at researchers in academia at various places, sort of Princeton, MIT, elsewhere, Chicago, Texas, and so on. Not under the control of the government, but creating an environment where it is possible for academics to develop and sustain a career that can support governments, create options and technical reality that can be exploited. Now, the UK hasn't done anything like that, and it would be very easy for the UK to do that, comparatively very cheap as well. So that's one thing that the UK could do, is bump up its commitment financially on arms control verification. The second thing it could do to make it politically meaningful is describe the circumstances in more detail under which it might in future join in with strategic arms control multilaterally. At the moment, it's only said at the right time or at the appropriate time. It hasn't said more than that. It hasn't said what other arrangements would need to be in place. I mean, are we proceeding on the assumption, for example, that the UK would only engage in strategic arms control as part of a coalition or independently, and do there need to be restrictions on other weapon systems in place before it does that? Does the collapse of INF, for example, would that mean that the UK would be more or less inclined to engage in strategic arms control? Probably less. So perhaps the UK should say that and start creating the circumstances where it's slightly more clear as to where the future is going. There are other points around transparency, I think, both with Parliament and with the public, as well as internationally, that I think are worth exploring further.
Can I just ask at this point, as a matter of clarification, when you were at Aldermaston, I think, at one stage, trying to clarify to what extent we are caught up in the slipstream, we are independent or caught up in the slipstream of American changing policy on this whole area. I mean, just as a matter of fact, America is concerned with our delivery systems, and we're trying to modernize theirs. But we manufacture and install the warheads, is that right? And America doesn't have any dictation over where our submarines are or anything.
Oh, no. So I think that the point that the government often makes about operational independence of the deterrent is, to the best of my knowledge, entirely correct, although I should be very careful to say where the bounds of my knowledge and competence are on this. So in terms of those issues, only tangentially involved, and you're better off, I think, asking government about those points. But in relation to the issues around warhead, issues around delivery system, the Trident missile is obviously US provided. The common missile compartment is obviously US provided with UK design input. The new fuses for the Trident nuclear warhead are, in the public domain as being US provided. And various other components, re-entry vehicle, aeroshell, the thing that's sort of a cone that contains the warhead. So there's this sort of question as to how much operationally independent, I think, is correct. Independence of production, supply, well, I think that's much more open to question.
Yeah. I just wanted to clarify that, because operational independence really is related to independence of view on how we proceed. All these things go together. But if we may move on, Baroness Coussins has a question.
Morning. I would like to ask you about modernisation plans, and my question is really in 3 parts. First of all, could you outline what are the current nuclear modernisation plans of the nuclear weapon states? And secondly, could you spell out in perhaps a little more detail to what extent new technologies such as cyber are incorporated as part of those modernisation plans? And perhaps say, as part of that, how well-founded you think the concerns that I've seen expressed by 1 or 2 commentators over the last year in background papers we've been reading, concerns that the new technologies that are inevitably involved might give rise or risk giving rise to unplanned or accidental conflict, or even nuclear activity by rogue states or hacker groups.
Right.
And then thirdly, and how to what extent the modernisation plans are taking account of those concerns. And then finally, could you give us your assessment about whether the modernisation plans are undermining the NPT and the wider disarmament regime?
Okay. Big portfolio. Well, if you'll forgive me, I won't do a whole rundown of all the nuclear weapon states plans, but if you don't mind, I'll give a sort of general answer, and then if you have any supplementaries on detail, if that's okay. So in sort of general terms, I think it's fair to say that every single state that possesses nuclear weapons, and I actually don't know about Israel, so I'll sort of give them a pass for now, is in some sense involved in a modernisation programme of some kind, of varying scale. Some can be described legitimately, I think, as modernisation, and I think it's fair to say, I'm as critical of the UK's operation of a nuclear deterrent as anybody, but I think it's fair to say that the UK is more accurately described as nuclear modernisation than perhaps, say, Russia's progress, which does look like, yes, there is a strategic renewal process. It operates on a relatively short cycle compared to some of the renewal cycle that, say, we and the US operate, which does give a slightly inflated impression of regular developments of new systems, when many of these are replacements. But it is also fair to say that they maintain the role of nuclear weapons in their doctrine, even potentially expand that, and have developed, in some cases, deployed systems that contribute to that expanded doctrine. So I think the character is different in that regard. For me, the Russian approach is not just modernisation. For the US, hard to say. The programme of record, the funded programme of record, which I understand still retains bipartisan support, and maybe a US witness can correct me on this, is still, I think, fairly characterised as one of modernisation. The potential programme laid out in the US Nuclear Posture Review could be more open to accusations of expansion of role, or at least returning to roles that had been assigned to US nuclear weapons before, say, Obama. I think for example, the withdrawal from service of nuclear cruise missiles, naval-launched nuclear cruise missiles, that might be something that comes back, in which case you're sort of saying, well, that is having taken a step back. Much as my answer to Baroness Smith earlier, the UK having taken a step to reduce nuclear weapons, it's not quite the same to step back up to where you were as if you just maintain that level. It is a different thing to go back to where you were before than just to maintain. So I think that's a sort of sketchy one. But honestly, we'll see how that plays out. I think it will be very difficult for the administration to get many of those plans funded through Congress. Leaving aside the Trump issue, the continuation of US-Russia arms control was pretty critical to continuing the consensus around funding that programme of record. So that one's yet to play out, and my understanding is that many of the systems that we see listed in the NPR are unlikely to make it to, even to the funding stage. In terms of other states, I think we should be thinking about India and China. Makes sense to me to think about China, both in terms of their expanding horizons. China in terms of its sort of beginning to flex its muscles in a way. I don't mean that in a sort of belligerent sense, although I think that's accurate in South China Sea. I mean it's sort of being assertive, standing up in its view for what it considers to be its place in the world. And one of the big milestones would be it's starting to operate nuclear ballistic missile submarines outside of its immediate ocean area. If it were to transition through what they call the first and second island chains, these are the island chains which surround China and mark quite helpful defensive boundaries for, say, the US, Japan and others. If the Chinese were able to effectively operate an SSBN outside those island chains, that is a step change in the deterrence landscape, and there's no sign that China wouldn't do that. Again, if you were in their shoes, saw yourself as a global power in a long-term rivalry with the US, then of course you'd look to do that. The second would be the Indians, who are significantly further behind, but evidently start to see more than a bilateral deterrence relationship with. They have a bilateral deterrence relationship with Pakistan, to some extent also with China, but considering their development of longer-range missiles and themselves as a nuclear submarine, a ballistic missile submarine, one has to look at their horizons and see how further they're drawn. So those would be the ones that I would be particularly looking at. Your second question was about new technologies and their role. I think there's two ways in which this is important. One, I'm going to lump together all the advances in cyber, space, AI, everything else, targeted, even to some extent, drone technology, micro-drone technology and things like that. A lot of these things taken together act to reduce decision-making time in a crisis. And those things I think it's absolutely right to say that it may well be that these things impose additional risks of nuclear use in such a crisis. It's not to say that those can't be managed, but I think it's fair that existing arms control mechanisms, as they collapse, in some cases are collapsing because of the development of these new... I mean, INF, for example, is a good example. I think, Russia has long been worried about something called the reconnaissance strike complex, this idea that US-led coalition would have such an advance in stealthy, long-range precision strike without using nuclear weapons that it would be able to achieve strategic effect and effectively blunt any sort of... would be able to then intercept the remains of any Russian nuclear response, removing Russia's nuclear deterrent through conventional means. That's just with long-range precision cruise. So if you were to then start looking at sort of technologies around AI and more wider use of cyber, I think it ultimately acts to confuse the decision-making of senior leaders. So does that then lead to a change in nuclear posture? Well, all of these developments are sort of propagating through now, so I don't have a good answer for you. I mean, we're doing some research on them actually, but I hope we will have some good answers in the longer term. But I think it's fair to say that those, as in the early Cold War, when there was the delicate balance of terror, the person shooting first is going to be the person who wins, in inverted commas, but they're going to end the world in the process. We may be heading in that direction again. And not necessarily, it's something that could be managed through the appropriate arms control diplomatic mechanisms, I'm sure. They just don't exist yet. And so more work needs to be done on those fronts. The second way in which new technology, particularly cyber, is relevant, I think, is in degrading the operation of deterrence at all, nuclear weapons at all. Supply chain risk is something that the US has been quite publicly expressed concern about. Let's talk about, the telecommunications space, say the role of Huawei in UK telecoms and others is something that the US is obviously concerned about. Now, if you extend, say, that concern to microchip manufacturing in general, the vast majority of those things are produced in China. And so if you had a concern about your supply chain in telecoms regard, then why not other systems which use these things? So I assume that both the US, the UK, and other responsible nuclear weapon states will be taking measures to account for that. We know it's a neuralgia. I mean, I'm assuming that the solution would be very highly classified. I have no idea what it would be, but I understand that responses are being taken there. In relation to other nuclear weapon states, maybe that's not seen as such a high priority. I honestly don't know. And maybe they're not seen as such a target for those sort of things. But so I'd have to leave you with sort of a hanging question there, I'm afraid. This last point, you also said this impact of modernisation programmes on the NPT as a whole. That's a really interesting and nuanced question, because I think I was trying to think of an analogy the other day for something like this, and I would say, if I had a rifle here and I put a safety catch on it, I've modernised that weapon in a way. I've improved its capability, but I've also made it safer. So, it's difficult to argue that that's not a disarmament step, but yet it is a modernisation step. Now, it has that effect, partly because you can see me doing it. Now, if I did it behind a screen over there and said, well, I've put a safety catch on this, but I'm not going to show you the rifle, that has a very different character to it. And of course, that's the state that I think we're in with, say, UK nuclear modernisation, for example. There's a sense where, in a way, obviously too much transparency is not possible, but the secrecy around it does lead to this sort of mistrust. I think it's possible to have modernisation that at least minimises impact on global nuclear disarmament. I think it's very hard to say that it's positive in any way, but I think it's possible to say that it minimises it. Again, I would come back to the fact that the non-proliferation regime is founded on many things. The NPT is the core of it, and a lot of that relates to disarmament, but not all. I mean, the NPT was originally effectively a security bargain between states who, yes, they did want to see the nuclear weapon states disarm, but they also didn't want to see their neighbours become nuclear states. So the bargain, to some extent, was if you don't develop, then we won't. And that bargain is still extant, as far as I see. So coming back to my original remarks about separating the document from the regime and non-proliferation from disarmament, I think it's important to think about these things in those different layers. I'm not seeing any great drivers for nuclear proliferation, say, from nuclear weapons modernisation. Horizontal proliferation, which is the spread of nuclear weapons from one state to another. There are drivers for vertical proliferation, which is the increase of capabilities within a state, effectively. I think that's probably how I would break that down.
Okay, thank you.
Lord Grocott.
Yes, very early on in your answer there, you said, I'm not going to mention Israel because I don't know much about Israel, which is, fair enough. But it just strikes me, and I'd be interested in your observation on this, that the one issue that doesn't seem to get discussed very much is the issue of the four nuclear powers that aren't signatories to the treaty. Now, for obvious reasons, one's in a different category. North Korea, we all know why it's pretty important to be clear about, as far as we can, about what's happening there. But for the other three, India, Pakistan and Israel, is it that they're just sort of parts? The view is that, we can't do much about it. These are nuclear states which aren't in the treaty. We don't know too much about how they're modernising or whether they're modernising because they're not a threat, an obvious threat maybe to, quotes, the West, unquotes. They may be a threat to each other, obviously, in case of India and Pakistan, and in case of Israel, they may be a threat to their neighbours. We don't know. But is this an issue which people in your community, the people that spend their lives assessing these things, have just kind of parked as something we can't or shouldn't do anything about, or are there great specialists that could tell us precisely how far they've developed their nuclear weapons and how much of a threat they are?
I think the answer to your second question is yes, there are. I'm not one of those people, I hasten to add. Though there are people who study these things. I mean, you're right to highlight that the three countries that you mentioned in particular, India, Pakistan and Israel in particular, gets very little attention.
Why is that?
Well, there's a number of practical reasons. One, it's going to sound incredibly mercenary, but somebody has to fund these things. So, as a think tanker, we're funded by governments, industry, non-profits, endowments, etc., memberships. And we have, there will be some funders who are more or less willing to look at different issues. And although it might be very, very interesting for us to spend time looking at Israeli nuclear weapons, if we can't find the funding to do that, that's very hard to do. So there is something around the funding landscape. I just want to be candid with you about that. That doesn't mean that there aren't people doing it. It just means
slightly worrying, though, isn't it? If we only inquire into those things where someone's willing to pay. It's understandable. It's a pragmatic answer, but it's not a very reassuring answer.
Well, totally. I would love to be in a position where we had complete freedom to look at anything we liked, and our funders were so hands off, and indeed some of them are. So we're very grateful to them for it. But they are few in number, and governments fund according to their priorities. India, Pakistan, on the other hand, is blessed with rather more analysts. I'm simply not one of them. If you were to call one back, I'm sure they'd give you a much better account than I'd be able to.
Lord Wood.
Just a quick question on another kind of modernisation, which is missile defence systems. So a lot of us will have seen the avant-garde, or however you pronounce it, Russian display over the New Year period. Is that a direct challenge to traditional notions of deterrence, or is it more a bargaining addition to the bargaining portfolio for more traditional negotiations in the future?
I think it's both in a way. I don't think there's a system out there that is not able to be bargained over in some way. Some things are more or less valuable than others, and it may be impractical for them to be bargained away totally. In a sense, avant-garde and other. Let's just talk about Russian attempts to defeat US missile defence in general. I think that's probably safe. I commented earlier that US missile defence was not performing as it had originally, that any of its proponents desired. They obviously argue that it will do. Russia is in a position where it can't take that for granted now, and it can't take for granted that will always be the case. So it fears to some extent what US missile defence will become. And that issue around the scenario being that in some kind of confrontation between, say, the US, the West and Russia, that the US and allies make a decision to use this reconnaissance complex strike that they fear to reduce Russian nuclear capabilities to the point where US and other missile defences could defeat any second strike. Obviously avant-garde and other systems, even stuff like the Status 6, the long-range nuclear torpedo, and other systems are about defeating that to some extent, securing second strike. They're not, I think, entirely for signalling purposes, because some of these things have been developed and deployed. The great example would be the INF busting system, which, I have this sort of open question as to, if, as some have said, this was all about gaining leverage to bargain with the US over insert problem here. There are a variety that get cited. Why do it in such secrecy? You know, why not signal? Why not conduct everything that was allowed to be conducted under the INF Treaty in relation to that system, R&D and so forth, as the US says it's going to do? It's going to do INF-compliant research on Grand Roy's nuclear proofs. The Russians could have done that. They did it in secret, which suggests to me that it has a purpose beyond bargaining, and I'd apply that reasoning to other systems as well. So there is a genuine security fear. There's also a role that the Russian military-industrial complex plays in this as well. I don't think we should forget this idea of, you know, the Kremlinology of Russian defence politics.
Sure.
Baroness Smith.
So, yes, thank you, Lord Chairman. Just a very brief follow-up to something you said about what gets funded for research and so on. And I wasn't going to declare an interest because my academic job is European politics, not nuclear deterrence. But it has did cause me on one occasion to write something about the problems of doing academic research. In a sense, think tanks have a similar issue of who is willing to fund what. And it does mean that certain things get more studied than others. Yeah. But in the absence of funding for certain things, and in light of the fact we're at the start of this inquiry, are there issues related to the topic of our inquiry that you think are underexplored that we might usefully be asking questions on?
That's a great question. I'd like, if I may, to reflect on that a little bit and revert in writing, if that's
Absolutely.
okay. I mean, the other thing I did want to say is I just wanted, when I was talking about funding, I just wanted to be as candid as possible with your lordships, effectively, rather than sort of selling a sob story, if you like. I don't think that was my intention at all. I just wanted to lay plain the circumstances that surround it. And as you quite accurately wrote, I think, you know, what gets funded affects what gets done. Yeah, let me think about that. I mean, aside from my other point that I made about sort of meaningful development on a sort of on an arms control research community within the UK, that does seem like something that could be developed. There are, you know, nascent, and there are centres of expertise at that in universities in London, in particular King's College London, for example, where I should do, again, I'm a visiting fellow there, so, but still, and elsewhere. But they are small. It is specialist. And so my thinking on this would be, if you were to identify, and you may not, if you were to identify that this is a big strategic issue, that it is in some sense fundamental to the geostrategic order, then it would seem sensible to rather devote slightly more attention to it, in academia, if not think tanks.
Lord Hannay.
On the INF, I wonder if you could just throw a little bit of light on your thinking about the prospects there. Is the INF Treaty now past praying for? Is it doomed because of the way, partly that the Russians have flouted it, and partly because of the way that the Trump administration are playing their reaction to that? Or is it savable in a slightly different form? For example, as a regional agreement which covers the whole of Europe, including, of course, Russia, but doesn't seek to inhibit the Americans in their dealings with China. Or is there another variant which would involve the treaty, as it were, ceasing to bind the two parties, but them accepting that they would never deploy these weapons? So could you just sort of give a feel for where you think the INF arguments are at, and what this committee, for example, could usefully say about this imbroglio?
Yeah, again, another toughie. I think to take your last question first, the sense that the treaty might fail, but you would be in some sense still bound, or at least act according to it, or never deploy these systems. I think the challenge is for the US that the Russians have already deployed the treaty-busting system. I mean, and they've said that they have in two different places. They've not said that they've deployed a treaty-busting system, but there are two different deployments that are cited, which I'm sure an expert will be able to go into in detail. So that's one. I don't think the US would trust it. Two, there's no bipartisan support for new arms control with a Russia that is not in compliance with its current agreements. And there's not a case for it. And frankly, as a proponent of arms control, I find it very hard to make the case that agreements that are not being complied with should be extended, or that agreements that are not being complied with that set a good tone for future discussions. That's not to say I think we should throw it onto the bonfire and be done with it, because I think, for example, New START, the Strategic Arms Control Reduction Treaty, is, by all reports from the US, being complied with by the Russians. And so if it still serves some value, as I think it does, for global security, then I think the UK's position should be to advocate for its extension strongly. So that's about, if you like, recognising that the house that we had built is collapsing, and that there needs to be a new arms control edifice constructed, but that demolishing the last remnant of the last one before we've even laid the foundations of the new one seems a little premature. In relation to the chance of saving INF by modifying it, you'd sort of run into legal issues in both the US and Russia. You could turn it into a presidential nuclear initiative equivalent. That's the only thing I can see that would sort of, the equivalent of a presidential nuclear initiative. So if you were to try and get a new treaty, because it would be seen as a new treaty, any modification to the INF text would have to be approved by the Duma in Russia, which would probably be doable if Putin wanted that to happen, but would also have to be approved by Congress in the US, and that seems a lot harder at present. I don't know if that would be true for this, so maybe others can speak to that. But there is that is the challenge that faces. The option would be to do something at the presidential level, which wouldn't be legally binding, would be a unilateral initiative and would be around restraint. Not a word I typically associate with President Trump, but also not going along with my last point around these systems already having been deployed by the Russians. There's this, how could you trust a declaration of restraint without verification? And if you're doing restraint with verification, then that looks an awful lot like arms control. So I think that's the problem that we have there. I think, should we still be praying for it? Well, I mean, I don't pray, but I would say, there's still a chance that this could happen, but it seems vanishingly unlikely. I think we just have to adjust ourselves to a future where the INF is not part of our security structure.
Let's come really to what probably was the last question, Lady Hannay.
Thank you, and thank you for really leading us through the political hardware and the R&D environment to which, as a committee, we are taking evidence in advance of the PrepCon and RevCon. At the very beginning, you mentioned something that Lady Smith took up, and that is that as we approach the RevCon, the UK has more to do to show its leadership role. So if you were back advising the government about how to exercise that leadership role at PrepCon and RevCon against this very difficult environment, where would your priorities lie in advising?
I mean, I think if I were back advising them as I was, I'd be paid no attention to. I was quite junior, I should say that. But I think, maybe in the future. I think I would reiterate the points I made before about this sort of, the UK makes a big show of commitment to arms control verification in particular. I think putting some political teeth behind that would make sense. Trying to understand how the activities that it's conducted are linked in the real world to potential future arms control scenarios. They devote a lot of attention to nuclear warhead dismantlement verification, for example, which for me that's an interesting one, isn't it? Some argue that is against the day where there is a great breakthrough made and we need technologies available quickly that will allow us to verify warhead dismantlement of, say, Russia, China, and they can come and verify ours. But it seems to me more practical to think about technologies that could verify the next arms control treaty, and I don't think that the UK is doing anything in that regard that I know of, and it could do, and it could say that it's doing that and show how those things are linked, and it hasn't done those things. So I think a little more, the UK has shown leadership in unilateral reduction. It hasn't shown leadership in the sense of taking things by the scruff of the neck, if you like, and saying that this is a path forward, or this is one of many potential paths forward that we can see. And I could see that being an option. That's not to say that there should be a UK grand plan for global nuclear disarmament, but we should at least have a sense of the possible futures that we would sit in and how we would help those happen. I think waiting for the right time it doesn't befit a member of the Nuclear Weapons State Group. It doesn't befit a permanent member of the UN Security Council. I think we have more to do there. There are things we can do on transparency as well, I think, which is worth thinking about. The UK, again, does a pretty good job, I think, in terms of international transparency around posture, nuclear planning, all this communication around, one deterrent system, its operation, detargeting, etc. And to some extent, the collaborations on arms control verification are a kind of transparency because they allow peer-to-peer working between nuclear weapon and non-nuclear weapon states, which is very, very important for trust building and mutual understanding. So more of that would be appropriate. But I think there's an element of one, detail, and two, internal transparency within the UK. I think if the UK were to be able to show, or others querying the posture of the UK would be able to see a vibrant domestic debate where those relevant ministries that are looking after the UK's nuclear deterrence were more open in responding to inquiries from Parliament and the public about certain details, were less willing to wave the national security restriction flag, which I think is totally justified in many cases, but I think is over-applied in relation to certain issues. I think that would be appropriate.
And just taking you up on that point, because there are different departments that clearly have a major role in this, and the Foreign Office leads on preparations for PrepCom and RevCon. Do you see, therefore, that they are both working in concert to conceal information?
No.
Or is it simply the way that Whitehall works? And can we take some leadership in showing what we are doing or not doing on modernisation, which might be in conflict with the existing treaties?
I think that one of the things, well, let me address the first point around concealing, because I don't think that there is some sort of cross-Whitehall conspiracy to conceal information that shouldn't be concealed. I should say that. I do think there is a cultural difference between the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence as it relates to responding to queries from researchers, the public, Parliament and so forth. I think having experienced both, my training in the Foreign Office was, informing Parliament is a privilege, and it felt like in the MOD informing Parliament is a duty. And those are two very different positions, aren't they? So I'd be interested in having that rebutted in a way that is credible by those current incumbents. The other thing I would find particularly useful in terms of a transparency commitment from, I think, the MOD in this case would be, the UK is going to make a decision on its new nuclear warhead by 2022. Now, that's what it said in its 2017 update to Parliament. The 2018 update to Parliament doesn't say anything about warhead timeline, which sort of always sets alarm bells ringing. And I think a commitment that decision would be taken to Parliament would be very, very sensible. It would be, if that weren't taken to Parliament, then that would feel like concealment. Let's put it that way. I think the expectation among researchers is that would be done. Not because, analytically we think that, but because that's the trajectory that the UK has taken. To not do that, having done it for Trident replacement, would seem to me again to be a step backwards. So that would be my sort of concrete suggestion there.
We had evidence in an earlier session from Dr. Ford, the US Assistant Secretary, about creating the conditions for a new nuclear disarmament, an initiative that is brewing up in the United States. Is that something you're aware of and support?
It's something I'm aware of, and I understand. I mean, I've seen the position paper that came out that sort of highlighted this idea. I think it was in the last preparatory commission to the NPT that that there had been a fairly expansive, actually, position paper put forward that said, we've been talking for a long time about we can't give up nuclear weapons entirely unless the circumstances are right, so we need to think about how to create the circumstances, and then this is our approach for doing that. The working group, what's been announced more recently and what Dr. Ford will have said, I imagine, will talk about the practical arrangements around that, which is, I understand, although details are yet to emerge, I think, and much like the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification, which is kind of multilateral. It is political, obviously, but it is more focused on sort of solutions, is the idea, at least, to create something in that model that works towards understanding what those conditions would look like. So, most charitably, it's an attempt to address the challenge that I've put forward to the UK about linking future arms control. What would you do? Under what circumstances would this happen? And then how might you create those? There is quite a lot of scepticism about it, not least because I think the initiative changed its name a couple of times over the course of the year, and that sort of never breeds certainty, I think. But I think that's a wait and see on that one. I don't see it as signalling a US change in policy. It does look more like a presentation exercise to me.
Can I, Lord Hannay wants another point. Yeah.
I just wanted to say whether I rightly understood, and I think I have, your answers in relation to the review conference, that it would be quite unwise to think that there is some great leap forward that can be achieved at this stage, and that we should be looking at we, the UK, we, this committee, and so on, should be looking at what you might call small steps, which could create greater confidence and which could perhaps stem the degradation of the international regime. Have I understood that rightly?
I think so. I think one thing that we haven't said at all, haven't talked about at all, is the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, or the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and its interaction with the dynamics of sort of the last review conference. I mentioned it, the dynamics around it briefly in my opening remarks, I think. The problem is, I think that that's right, but the problem for that approach is that is not going to be enough for many of the ban advocates in particular, and the states that support them. And so the question is, I suppose, whether that enough nucleates around that as a seemingly viable alternative, or if nothing else, a scream of diplomatic rage. I think the crack in the wall will come, if it comes, and I don't think it's guaranteed to, when a state decides that it would prefer to discharge its non-proliferation obligations under the Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons than it would under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There are lots of mechanisms that would restrict that from happening, that would restrain a state from making that decision. It's not the kind of decision that would be made by the groups that... one of the issues that you have with many states is that the policies around non-proliferation and disarmament are very rarely a supreme national priority. They're not top of the head of state's list of issues. Now, withdrawing from the NPT, on the other hand, would quite quickly become top of the head of state's list of issues, because you would have a succession of major partners beating down their door to make plain the consequences and so forth. It's not to say that wouldn't happen. There are lots of restraining factors, but that's where I would see the first serious challenge to the NPT coming. Where states discharge their obligations in connection with both, to the extent that it doesn't mind the NPT, we'll have to see what the practical implications of that are. But again, if states are forum shopping to verification requirements on non-proliferation, for example, under the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, are much less stringent than they are under the NPT treaty, that's a step backwards for disarmament and non-proliferation. It's hard for that to be cast as anything else. The scream of rage may be justified, but it doesn't mean the subsequent lashing out is productive. I think that's essentially where I'd sit on it. So, that's a long way of saying yes, it is small steps, but we should be conscious that it is not going to be enough for some, and finding ways to sort of at least, restrain any lashing out, to use my previous characterisation, that comes cooperatively. I don't mean in a sort of confrontational sense. In the UK's position to sort of make clear and demonstrate, to show, not tell, commitment to disarmament and non-proliferation, I think is warranted.
I would end by asking a more general question, which possibly makes the whole non-proliferation debate more difficult. We've been used to talking for the last few decades about escalation and the ladder of escalation in the use of nuclear weapons. Is that becoming an out-of-date concept, as the whole thing turns into a much more complicated web? And if it does, how are we going to cope with non-proliferation, meaning of all kinds of intermediate weapons as affected by the INF, as well as, of course, intercontinental weapons? Isn't that a new difficulty? What do you think about that?
Well, the whole idea of a ladder of escalation is sort of one paradigm for understanding how conflict might develop between one or more actors. I don't think it's invalidated, by the way. I think it's a useful tool in some circumstances. We just have to recognise where it's more usefully applied. But what you're talking about, it seems to me, is this sort of sense of a greater spread of not just nuclear, but capabilities that then might provoke nuclear use, to more states with more independent centres of decision-making, a world that is not just bilateral or even, plurilateral, multilateral within a coalition, so NATO, Russia, for example, but has a number of interacting regional security complexes. So the India-Pakistan complex can no longer be seen as a bilateral. It now incorporates China and maybe even Russia, which means that then has an interaction with the US, France, UK, and so on. And then if you were to add in other issues around, say, long-range conventional precision strike to that, as I alluded to earlier, you bring in non-nuclear weapon states for that mix. So, yeah, you're right to say that there are a lot of things that will complicate this picture. But the factors that restrain or that can be that can restrain military capability developments in those states have not changed. The perception of external risk, the presence of alliances, the presence of diplomatic processes that reduce tensions between states, that increase trust, people-to-people or peer-to-peer contacts can all do the things that they did in the Cold War. They just have to do it with more actors now. And we're yet to see those processes interact. We have seen, in the Cold War, for example, US-Russia Academy of Sciences exchanges. There had been similar things between the US and Chinese. There could be similar exchanges between, say, academies of sciences or other bodies, for example, between other groups, other states. It will be harder work, there's no question of that. But I think it requires repurposing and updating these tools, which were, admittedly, not wholly effective, but partially effective and acted to restrain risk, at least. I think that there is a prospect for that, at least, if work is done to move it forwards.
Right, well, I think we'll have to leave it there. We'd like to go on drawing on your wisdom because it's been fascinating, many of the things that you've had to say, but time moves on. So can I say on behalf of the committee, thank you very much indeed for all that you've told us and giving us your time. Extremely valuable. We're very grateful.
No, I'm very grateful to you. Thank you for the opportunity to give evidence. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Excellent.
The proceeding has ended.